Devil fruits are strange and powerful, and they can grant the user immense power for the downside of being unable to swim. But they remain a big mystery in the One Piece world, at least until we get more of Vegapunk, that is. But we can definitely see implications of devil fruits all around the One Piece world, and it could very well be that the Ancient Kingdom were the ones that made the devil fruits based off of different lineage factors, such as zones from animals, mythical zones from animals that existed in ancient times, and logias such as the Marimara Nomi could contain lineage factors from Lunarians. And there possibly could have existed other races with specific powers and lineage factors as well, that other devil fruits were created from. Now the list could go on and on. Luffy's Awakening is a hot topic, and we've seen so many different awakenings throughout the show with some names including Doflamingo, Katakuri, and most recently, Kid and Law. Let's talk a little bit about Kid's Awakening. As we know, with Paramecia Awakenings, they imbue the properties of their fruit into their surroundings. Kid's Awakening is very interesting, but we don't really know its limits. He can apply the properties of magnetism to his surroundings. If we assume it is limitless with whatever he does assign, then it can be the case that he uses a sign north or south on one island, and a sign north or south on another island, basically the opposite, and he could possibly have them collide. Now that would be extremely powerful, and if it's limitless, we can go even a step further. He could potentially assign two different planets and have them collide as well. Now, it's very interesting stuff to think about, but I think the power scalers might have it out for me, so let's move on. Kid's Awakening could be key in bringing islands together as well, which would relate to the One Piece is a string of islands theory, and if you do want more details about that, I did release a video on it explaining it in depth, and I'll leave it in the description below, but it basically goes something like this. When Big Mom mentioned that some of it is here too, in relation to the One Piece and Wano, it could be the case that since Wano is comprised of islands, some of the islands comprising Wano make up the One Piece, and that the complete One Piece would need a couple more specific islands to be connected to Wano as well. Now, it's very interesting stuff to think about, and it is some good food for thought for how big of a role Kid could play in the future of One Piece. Now, let's get to Law's Awakening. Law's Awakening does not really differ from other Paramecia's awakenings, although it may seem that way just because of how strange his devil fruit is. But like all other Paramecia awakenings, he's simply imbuing the properties of his fruit to his surroundings. And I say simply, but awakening is probably not that easy to achieve. Now, in this case, he's imbuing his sword with the properties of his devil fruit, and he can then easily pierce the enemy with his sword, which does not deal damage straight away, but it allows Law to use his fruit inside the body of the enemy, which it can then lead to a great deal of power, as we did see against Big Mom, where he was able to pierce her and then release an explosive shockwave, which did internal damage. Even Big Mom mentioned that it was a dangerous ability. Now, his application of his fruit properties to his surroundings also allow him to greatly expand his sword. As we did see when he pierced Big Mom, he had it reach from Onigashima to the island near the flower capital below. It was so powerful that he was able to cause a huge explosion, and from such a distance as well. It's definitely very strong. Now on to Luffy's Fruit. Now, it's safe to say, in an arc so heavily focused around devil fruits, with the smiles, the Gorosei talking about a specific devil fruit, the fruit Momo ate, and whatnot, I think Luffy will showcase something new as well with his fruit. And I think it will be Awakening, which will lead to Gear 5. Now, you might be asking, well, what would Luffy's devil fruit Awakening look like? Well, so far, we know that Paramecia's awakenings can impact the environment around them. We saw this with Doflamingo impacting his environment by turning it into strings, and we saw it with Katakuri where he impacted his environment and turned it into mochi. So with this in mind, it would lead us to believe that Luffy's fruit will be similar, if it is a Paramecia fruit. Now let us go with the assumption that Luffy's fruit is a Paramecia type fruit. Rubber Awakening can look something like impacting the environment around the user to be rubber, sort of like a bounce house. Now, what are the combat implications of this? Well, in a way, it could make balance for standing opposition difficult, and he could very well mutate the rubber ground to form around the enemy, sort of like Inazuma in Impel Down and Marineford. The ground would gobble up the user. But as we know from chapter 1041, it is heavily hinted that the Gorosei were talking about Luffy's fruit in particular, as they had ordered CP0 to eliminate Luffy at once, which can be interpreted in a way where they want to prevent an awakening in general in this battle, so it could refer to Kaido's devil fruit as well, but I am going to lean on it being Luffy's fruit for two reasons. One is because they had already experimented on Kaido's fruit, and they know that any future tough battle with a tough opponent, such as Blackbeard, Shanks, Akainu, etc., would allow the same opportunity for his fruit to awaken again. And another is that Kaido has had his fruit for a very long time, and I imagine he has had many tough battles such as the one with Luffy and Oden. Now, it leads me to believe it is about Luffy's fruit, though the possibility still does exist that it is Kaido's fruit or some other fruit. Now, assuming it is Luffy's fruit that the Gorosei had mentioned was a legendary fruit that had its name changed, from what we know about Luffy's abilities now, what are the possibilities of the fruit? Well, I'm going to lean on the Gigantification theory, and the reason for this is three simple reasons. Luffy is able to expand any part of his body. The Gorosei mentioned this was a legendary awakening, and immediately after, in the same chapter, Zunisha had appeared. And the Gorosei had this fruit in their possession, and they charged heavy penalties for Who's Who was a top talent when he lost the fruit to Shanks. Now, the government are very interested in Gigantification, and we know that the world government have heavily studied it in the past. Now, it makes sense why the world government would fear Gigantification so much, because with Gigantification comes a lot of power. Let's focus on Luffy for a bit. We've seen him expand his body and stretch his body even at a very minuscule level on many different occasions. What if his awakening takes that a step further, where he can influence his entire body and the environment around him and expand them to a gigantic size? Now, it is unclear whether this would work on others or not, but let us assume it did. And let us assume that if it is the fruit that the world government are talking about, that it had a previous user that had awakened, as they did mention that it had not awakened for centuries, and this would imply that it was awakened at some point in the past. If we assume Joy Boy to be the previous owner of the awakened fruit, and if we also make the assumption that he was able to use its awakening on Zunisha, who was his companion, to make it the size that it is today, then we can assume it works on others as well. This would potentially allow for Luffy to have immense levels of power, both for Luffy himself and for possibly expanding anyone around him to the size of a giant, allowing him to possibly have an army of giants. Of course, this is something the world government would fear and would also be greatly interested in, which is why they would want to have that fruit in order to study it, but also prevent it from falling into other hands. But it was stolen from them. Perhaps Shanks knew about the world government's plan, and he wanted to prevent the world government from possibly having access to that power. Thank you so much guys for watching, and if you did like that video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe, and please let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you so much, and take care.